but it was because there were multiple, similar to this, I suppose, it was multiple panel discussions, and I ended up, and the same thing happened. The problem was, is no one said, this is panel 3, when I was in fact looking for like room 4 or whatever. No one said that until it was like, we were 10 minutes in, and by then it was like, it's too late, it's fine, I'm here, I'm committed.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Callie, very quickly.
Sure.
When we get to the end portion and you're talking about the Old Gods podcast and thing, and stuff like that, this came up in feedback that Lynn received when she submitted her piece to the App Studies Journal.
Yeah.
For review. They were really clear about using the phrase Appalachian Englishes, use the plural.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, they wanted her to include more of the content in the Hazen book that you and I have recently purchased.
Yep.
So I'm going to share that with her because they want more of that in her lit review.
Oh, totally. Well, and I want to mention, like,
just
again,
saying,
this is
English, we're out of date already. So
totally. Yeah, this is going to be dependent on time, but if I have an opportunity, I want to talk about like the features and where I'm drawing them from, because it's specifically Hazen's work that focuses on features that are common to the majority of Appalachian Englishes, and that they are then more familiar in the podcast, and why we're picking those features to study. And so again, if I have time, I'd like to mention those, but if not, I'll just make sure I use the plural. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. I knew you were familiar with it, but because we just received the feedback this week, it's really fresh in my mind. So
totally.
And if
I'm working on that book review too. I'm hoping to have it done next week, so that'll be nice.
Yeah, and Rasmia, if that applies to you as well, when you're talking about the Appalachian English variant, you can talk about the variant recognized here regionally, but when you talk about it broadly, try to remind yourself to use it in the plural.
Yeah, I think I'll probably, like, based on my slides, only discuss like this particular variant, and I'll make a note of that. So
perfect. Thanks. Yeah, and I don't know about you guys, but I guess it's the size of our PowerPoint production, like the whole thing. I cannot download it. Even like it will not download. It won't open even in the browser via OneDrive. So I'm reading my notes from Outlook. Like I'm opening in a preview window in Outlook just so I can see the notes.
I mean, your notes haven't changed. So if you have a copy of your work, great, then you should be able to work on that outside of a browser window. That's up to you. Right.
See, this is why we keep inviting you back, Callie.
This is why you keep me around. Like my taste in jewelry and my tech support. That's pretty much it. But so legit, like you shouldn't, what I'd like to make sure we do is the lot of us should make sure that like our tech drain is as low as possible. Yeah. I know, Michelle, you've had this experience where you've been like, I have someone else in the house who is on a video call, and because of that, my video is crappy. Like this applies to our machines as well. So if you've got additional browser windows open, like just shut that stuff down, open it up again later. I'm shutting off my, Michelle, you know I work off like 6 computers at once.
Yes.
So I'm shutting off all of my other computers so that I'm not drawing additional bandwidth for where I'm at. This matters more for me. So I'm sorry, Michelle Marone, I interrupted you.
That's all right. No, I have it set up now that I can see you and I can keep the screen set. I have 4 computers.
I feel you. I get it.
You're going to have all kinds of new certifications to qualify you when this whole conference is over, Michelle.
Oh my gosh, yes. Hey, don't knock tech support. That's one of the reasons my husband still has the job he has, is because he's not only an amazing geologist, but he's one of the only rock scientists who can figure out how to make conferences work. So it's cool.
There we go. Well, Sean is still working because of tech as well. You know, all the communicators on campus lost their jobs in May, but fortunately, technology and broadband are an issue, and he's a tech writer in all those areas.
Totally. Yep.
So, Michelle, you're the convener. So when you get started, you know, I'm just going to, at 9 o'clock, just go for it, okay? And you can manage, you know, the chat however you want to do it. At this point, you're probably pretty skilled with using Teams for this kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, we're planning. Thank you. We're planning to have Callie running the slides from her machine.
Okay.
I'll just be saying stuff like, okay, we can move to the next slide. And then when I'm done talking, because I do the intro part, then Rasmia will present her study, and then, or Callie is next, and then Rasmia will present her study. So.
Right. And then try to keep it, on schedule so that you wrap up by 10:15.
Yeah.
So that
we're going to try and wrap, I guess, by 10, so we have time for some conversation and questions and such. But
and then just to let you know, as you know, we didn't have conference registration, so we really have no idea how many people are going to be attending these sessions. Right. So with this being the first one, if you only have a couple people, don't be disheartened. We're recording everything, so it'll be viewed for, by others after. So just to let you know that too. All right.
Okay. Is there a plan to kind of curate all of the electronic stuff and make it available in a different form? You know how a lot of times I know there's the submission possibility for a print piece, but.
A plan, it will be curated.
A plan.
We're just trying to get through the next 40 days. And then we'll see. But yeah, they'll be
Step
available.
one.
Yeah, that's right. Step one.
A day at a time. We're good.
All right, I'm popping over to my other session.
All righty, have a good one. Thank you. All right, so at 9 o'clock, I guess, 9:01, whatever, I'll begin the thing, and then Callie, you can pull up the slide once we have a sense of people having checked in. Does that sound good?
And I'm comfortable, depending on what we choose to do in terms of giving people a couple minutes or starting right at 9 o'clock. It doesn't really matter to me, just so long as Michelle Marone is handling who's recording and how that's recording. Because if I need to record, then I need to know to push those buttons. But I think she should be handling that.
Yeah. And FYI, it's Maroney whenever
I was going to ask. I was going to be like, what's that?
Did someone just ask about recording?
Oh, hi, Anne. Good morning. Yeah. Who's pushing the recording buttons?
Yeah, I am taking care of that because
Perfect.
I have the administrative access.
Thank you.
So it's actually our recording. We're just going to cut off the first 15 minutes before we post it.
Oh, we're already recording? Awesome.
Yeah.
I dig it.
Yeah, because I have 5 sessions going at a time. So I just start them all, and then we're just going to edit the film.
Dig it. That's how I do it. Like, let's just turn it on and capture everything. And then if we need
to, then we'll worry about it later. Yep. I just want to make sure I didn't forget somebody. So that's why I just went ahead and started them all.
More footage, more better. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I meant to mention it, Rasmia, your hair looks amazing. Like, I don't know what you did, but it looks great.
Thank you. I showered. That's about it.
Truly at this point, like, being able to say I showered is something that, like, we should all be proud of.
Definitely.
Love it.
Yeah, remember we're recording, so.
It's fine.
About what I was going to say about what I did in preparation, but I am presenting in my slippers.
There you go. Before this, I definitely took my dog. It's raining here. I don't know what it's like down in Athens right now, but so I took my dogs outside, and my older dog is very much like, he's very anti-rain. Like, if it's raining, he'll walk out on the porch and he'll just look back at me like he's offended. He'll be like, what is this? Why did you make me come out here for this? My younger dog leaps off the porch, realizes mid-leap that it's raining, and then lands looking sad.
Oh.
But so I took them out this morning, and they pulled their sad rain faces. And I was like, you guys, you got to do this now. Like, we got to go out now. Mom's got work.
Yep. I'm not coming back.
Nope. You're going to have to chill on the couch for the next hour and a half.
Yeah, no, we have some sunshine down here, but I can definitely see the dark clouds up your way.
Yep, they're coming.
So one other thing, don't forget to self-introduce, okay? To tell everybody who you are and who you're, affiliated with and that type of thing. Okay. Hey, I see Tiffany Arnold's popping in.
Hey, I could not support my fellow OU peeps.
Yeah.
You this morning.
Michelle, did you?
I'm sorry. I wish I was broadcasting in my kitchen, Tiffany. You'd be able to see my artwork that you and your husband did for me in the background.
Nice. Mine is still on the front porch. I didn't know where else to put it.
All right, I'm heading out. You won't see me again until the session because I'm doing this other session. Okay, so good luck.
Well,
Thank you.
it looks like we got some other folks checking in.
Oh yeah. Dr. O, do you want to do introductions right at the beginning or do you want to do them before our sections?
I think it'd be a good idea to do them at the beginning because we'll be sharing administrative duties throughout, you know, with advancing slides and stuff like that. And then it makes it easier for you and Rasmia and I to, you know, like to comment as the others are presenting.
Totally.
Like if something you wish the other person would be saying, feel free to do it. And that way the attendees will understand who's chiming in too.
Cool. You guys, when you'd like me to advance slides, please just say slide. There is no need for you to be like, hey, Callie, can you please, would you mind giving me the next slide? Like, don't waste your time. Just say slide. I get caught up in that too. Like, I'm like, can I please have the next slide? Like, I'm trying to be nice. And it's just like, please just say slide. It's easier.
Okay. Well, I see that it's 9 o'clock. So why don't we go ahead and get started so that we can, you know, at least start the day on schedule.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone who is in attendance at panel number 2 for the first day of the 2021 Appalachian Studies Association Conference here in virtual Athens. My name's Michelle O'Malley, and I will be both the panel convener and one of the presenters, along with my colleagues, Callie Thayer and Rasmia Schramm. We are all 3 associated with the linguistics department here at Ohio University. And I'm going to give each of my colleagues an opportunity to introduce themselves. And then we will jump into our presentation because there's a lot to talk about and we're hopeful we'll have time to make conversation windows available as well. So Callie, would you like to go next?
For sure. Thank you, Dr. O'Malley. As Dr. O'Malley mentioned, my name is Callie Thayer. I am currently soon to be graduating master's student in the Applied Linguistics program at Ohio University. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work with Dr. O'Malley and her research group over the last 2 years on these.
When major events happen in states like
I think we've got, let me bring that up then. That means I'm also our tech support person. So if you are not muted, if you could do yourself the favor of checking to make sure you are, remembering that you are always unmute on Teams. You should always check and make sure that you are muted because you might not be. So give yourself that opportunity. I'm going to start again, if that's okay. So my name is Callie Thayer, and I am a soon-to-be graduating master's student in the Applied Linguistics program at Ohio University. And I've been lucky enough over the last 2 years to be working with Dr. Michelle O'Malley and her team on the Southern Ohio Language Project, the Ohio Voices Project, a whole bunch of different linguistically focused projects here in and around Athens and in Southeast Ohio. And I'll be speaking about some of those projects today, as well as if you're here about the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, we'll hopefully touch on that at the end. I'm going to pass it over to my friend and colleague Rasmia so she can introduce herself as well.
Thank you. So my name is Rasmia Schramm, and I'm an undergraduate senior at Ohio University. I am a communication sciences and disorders major with a sociolinguistics minor. And I've been working with Dr. O'Malley in the Ohio Language and Culture Lab for about 2 years, I think. And yeah, I'm really excited to share my research with you guys today. So.
All right, thank you. So introductions complete. Thank you both. I'm excited to be here with Rasmia and Callie. They've been with me from the beginning. And we will talk about the Southern Ohio Language Project now. Callie, if you want to go ahead and start the slides. Callie will be our slide advancer, and we will talk about the SOLP, or the Southern Ohio Language Project, which is the large project within which our Language Matters campaign and the Ohio Voices Project live. This is really a construction that was envisioned as a space for students to be involved in language documentation, data gathering, language study, and also ultimately a space where community can be involved. The long-term goal is that this project be a space that students can move in and out of, and that the data become available to a larger audience, that folks can contribute as well as access that data. So we're moving toward that with some of the smaller projects inside. And you'll get a sample of those projects when both Callie and Rasmia share the work that they're doing with the data that's been generated over the years. So I'll introduce the SOLP initially, and I'll talk about those embedded projects. And with the collaboration of both Callie and Rasmia, we will describe our community engagement efforts and the student research that's emerging from this space. Slide. So a little bit of background as to why we exist and what we're thinking here. As you can see from the dialect map, studies of English in the areas that overlap with Southern Ohio have been numerous, starting with the Linguistic Atlas of the North Central States, continuing through Dakin's 1966 work of the Upper Ohio Valley, the Dictionary of American Regional English, and smaller studies that graduate students have done, that regional faculty have completed. What's missing, however, slide, is a focus on the space where we reside here in Southern Ohio. So Ohio varieties that we're documenting and investigating have not been identified as such. They've generally been included as a subregion of a South Midland variant, perhaps as adjacent to Western Pennsylvania, maybe a Central Appalachian variant. But, you know, as people like Preston might even suggest, there is no South Midland at all, just a Northern, a General Midland, and a Southern variant in the US. And then superimposed on those are the cultural variants that we all perform on a daily basis, many of us using multiple variants ourselves. Slide. So it's here, along with colleagues and students, that the Southern Ohio Language Project aims to take up the task of documenting, preserving, and celebrating the Englishes of Ohio, with a specific focus on the variations that are observed in the 29 counties in southeastern Ohio. They were previously unnamed in this space, some of which are actually identified as Appalachian as well as southeastern Ohio. Others, like Fairfield County, which you can see in the upper left of your slide there, are designated as Southeast, but not necessarily Appalachian. So proximity is always a relevant talking point when we discuss language, form, function, variation, and change, of course. If you look at the map to the right on your screen, you'll notice that the regional designations do not overlap with Southern Ohio. And you can see the little boot just above the W in West Virginia that indicates Meigs County. Directly north of Meigs County is Athens County, where we currently are placed. And while we exist within previously designated Appalachian regions, the language of these spaces is generally included in larger studies, but not identified as specific to where we are. Slide. So while the language of Southeast Ohio is historically understudied, it is a region in Central Appalachia that exhibits varying degrees of traditionally Appalachian features. And what contributes to those degrees is of interest to us. So we're trying to move beyond the geography and the migration study to look at the language in these spaces where we're able to investigate a speaker's sense of place, of identity, of rootedness, as Paul Reed has introduced into the discussion in recent years. So we're looking at where one feels they fit in a rural-urban divide, or with respect to the Athens bubble, which is something that'll come up in one of the later slides. That's a reference to the first major study to come out of this project. You'll notice here that the SOLP is a large-scale corpus project. We started this in 2017 with the help of a visiting faculty member at the time. We're looking to catalog the language and the stories of speakers who've spent at least 2/3 of their lives in Southeast Ohio. We prefer that they're born here. So you'll notice that in some of our data, there are certain speakers that have to be eliminated for certain studies based on birthplace and length of residence. But that's the general guide for folks whose data is included. in that space. We've completed to date 52 sociolinguistic interviews, which gives us over 75 hours of recorded voice and story data. Within the Southern Ohio Language Project is another smaller project called the Ohio Dialect Survey. I'll touch on that a little later. This is an online survey that's available 24/7, and we have 55 responses to that to date. And that's an attempt at looking at language variation, perception, and use across the state. The Language Matters campaign is something that Callie will take up later. Within that is a podcast series in development, but really not something we can talk about in great detail yet. Ohio Voices is where we are taking samples from our interviews here, and we're able to include short story segments of a minute, 2, 3 at the most, with a transcription on the side, and folks are able to listen to the voices and the stories of the region. And this is the space where the community access, I believe, is most important. This is a space where I envision something like the NPR StoryCorps living, where community members all over Southern Ohio are able to access this space and add their voices, add their stories, and also listen to the stories of their friends and neighbors. The campus signage and translation work is something that Callie will take off with whenever her slides begin. But I'm going to talk now more specifically about the first major study to come out of our collected interviews. Slide. We'll talk about how we accessed that, a few considerations that we always have with respect to field work. And I know this isn't new to anybody, but as an academic and as an advisor of students, we're always very aware of our otherness. Whether we grew up in the region or not, as soon as we approach someone to collect their stories or to interview or to interact with them, you know, we are not perceived as local. So despite having grown up in a very similar cultural and linguistic space in Southern Pennsylvania, I am nevertheless a transplant to Athens, despite the fact that I've been here for 25 years. So when we're entering those local communities, we are always looking to meet people who have lived and worked there and who can connect us with their students, with their friends, right? The Milroy friend of a friend connection process is how you make your inroads. We all do that. We work in that space. We've found particular success in local libraries and through high schools in particular. And I've been fortunate in the early years of trying to build this project to have at least one student in my undergraduate population who is a local kid from Athens, who can introduce me to friends, but also who can take their classmates who are studying this content into their schools. They meet their teachers introduce them to their friends. And that's been a great way to make connections with the community and for folks to collaborate. Sometimes recording problems are an issue. You know, we're using phones primarily, but because we're not examining great phonetic detail in most of the stories, now in the first study we do, but in most of the projects, it's not important that we have soundproof space for recording. The first study will get at that though. So let's check that one out and see what we're able to do with some of the data that we're gathering. Slide. So the first study, the first recognizable study that came out of our project was actually presented at CCAL in 2018. That's the Southeastern Conference on Linguistics. That was down in Blacksburg. And we had just completed our first round of data gathering. And we were noticing some differentiation in the pronunciation of the owl diphthong. And so we created a sociophonetic examination of that from our data. I'll talk about that study now, and then I'll also address some of the current developments and where we're going to go with this particular question form moving forward, what students are doing with it now. Slide. There we go. Okay, so just a bit of background. Previous studies on the owl diphthong in the US note that this production is both phonologically and regionally constrained. So specifically speaking, the owl is known to be more fronted and raised when it's followed by a nasal. So the prescriptive or the mainstream variant of the diphthong would be starting in the low central ah space, and we would say town or foul, right? But when the following segment is a nasal, we find that that diphthong tends to be produced farther forward in the mouth and a little higher. So it tends to come out more like town as opposed to town. When the following segment is not nasalized, however, like with an L following, or in the word mouth and foul, we tend to retract that. We anticipate the following sounds, and that's what we're doing here. Regionally, we know that there is non-fronting in certain regions of the country, moderate fronting in most of the North America, and then really strong fronting in other places. So we're going to look at that on another slide. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a map of the atlas on OW, and this is from the Labov et al. Atlas of North American English from 2006. The green circles that you can see indicate speakers with a moderate amount of fronting. The yellow circles indicate non-fronting. In other words, they sound very prescriptive, if you will. Just a town, a mouth, no modification based on the following segment. And the orange circles indicate speakers with extreme fronting and raising. So we use the criterion of the second formant of that being greater than 1800 hertz. And we'll talk very briefly about the measurements. It's not necessary to have the acoustics all internalized, but to recognize perceptually what's going on. We also note that the strong fronting of owl is not just situated in the South. It's pretty well distributed throughout the Midland. Slide. So in terms of social correlates of owl, Labov et al. Note that there's really no indication of owl fronting in progress, which means it's not something that we're noticing in a generational transmission kind of thing, meaning that older speakers do it, and as your participants decrease in age, we notice it less and less. That doesn't seem to be what's happening. It suggests that owl fronting is not one of the ongoing mainstream changes. Unlike the oo and the o that are appearing to be fronted across the country, the caught merger. Here in Athens, it's the hawking kind of contrast thing. That vowel merger is happening over much of the country. This owl fronting does not appear to be moving in the same direction. Labov and colleagues even note that in the mid-Atlantic area and in the South, both of which border us here in Southeast Ohio, owl is in fact backing, suggesting that a lot of regions with conventionally fronted owls are moving in the opposite direction. Slide. So our questions were, what is the status of the owl diphthong in rural Southeast Ohio? Is it fronting or not? And second, what are the factors that characterize the patterns of this production in rural Southeastern Ohio? Slide. Okay, and then now just to orient all of us to Athens, I realize we are all virtually in Athens right now, but for those of us who do not reside here, who are not physically in our space right now, these maps should orient you to where we are again. This is clipped from the previous Atlas of North American English with the Southeast Ohio region circled. And you can see that there's obviously no consensus about whether Southeast Ohioans front this diphthong or not, and if so, to what degree. There's no circle at all in there, so we don't know if they're thinking moderate or significant or at all. So what's indicated in yellow in the map on the right is the area that our project's been targeting in terms of data production. Okay, slide. So with reference to the cultural aspects of Athens, separate from the physical characteristics that we looked at on the previous slide, Athens is a mixture of urbanness and ruralness, with the urban element mainly attributed to the university, the existence of a university. I venture to guess here that nobody would characterize Athens as urban in any sense otherwise. We are not an urban center. But many of the businesses and the community events are heavily, if not solely, relying upon OU students and faculty for their existence, which is what lends itself to this notion of Ohio University people versus non-Ohio University people. And that is a very social reality here. If you look at the population during the school year versus the summer, and you can see from our most recent census data what that difference is, you get a real sense of how much of a college town Athens really is. So another important theme that emerges is demonstrated in the language that we observe. We have a majority students in Athens from the state of Ohio, but they are not from Athens, Ohio, or even from Southeast Ohio. The majority of the students here come from probably Highway 70 north, from Columbus north. Okay, slide. So when we started to examine data, we used 16 of the interviews that we had currently collected in order to conduct the study of the owl diphthong in southeastern Ohio. Obviously, as part of the eligibility requirements, they met those that I mentioned earlier, native to the region. Those that we did identify were all European Americans in background. We had 6 males and 10 females. We had a vast age range. As it turned out, 3 of the participants were young Athenians, meaning they lived within the city limits. And 13 participants were non-Athenians, but they were some in the 0 to 25 range and others beyond that age range. Okay, next slide. So what we measured, and we did this from the story data that we collected in those sociolinguistic interviews, and identified all of the individual words that used the owl diphthong. And then in our Elon transcriptions and our Prot realizations, we measured components of each vowel. So each measurement we took contributed to our overall understanding of this production. The first formant always gives us information about how raised the vowel is. In other words, what a speaker is doing with their jaw, how high is their jaw in production. And the second formant gives us information about how fronted the vowel might be. In other words, how far forward is my tongue body whenever I produce that vowel. So using these 2 measurements, we were able to plot approximate locations of those vowels for each speaker's vowel space. And we measured how diphthongal each production was by measuring the Euclidean distance between the nucleus and the glide, the nucleus being the onset of the diphthong and the glide being the offset. And you can see in our notations on the slide, you see the A and the W inside the parentheses. The A is the nucleus or the onset. The W represents the off glide or just the glide. Diphthongs are by nature 2 productions, as opposed to just saying ah, we say I or ow. So we were able to measure those distances between those 2 productions, and that gave us individual measurements for each speaker. We also measured the Euclidean distance between the lot and the mouth vowels just to have some basis for comparison. We are dependent variables. Whoops, did I get that on the other slide? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, go ahead. So the formants and Euclidean distances that just described were the independent variables. As independent variables that could have an effect on these productions, we also included age, sex, and location. And by location, we meant Athens versus non-Athens, basically residents within the city limits or in the county and beyond. As well as phonological context, meaning is the following sound a nasal sound, an N and M, or an eng, or is it a non-nasal sound? Duration is a factor in a lot of models, but we're not going to address that in this one. That would be for later studies. And then all the formant values reported will be normalized. Okay, let's go to the next slide. When we start looking at results, the effective neighborhood gave us our most significant results. There was no effect really for sex, but there was here based on whether or not you lived in town or not. Speakers were categorized again as Athenians if they were born and raised in the city limits, non-Athenians if they're outside and in the county. You notice that non-Athenians exhibit a higher degree of the raising and a higher degree of fronting than non-Athenians. We can go to the next slide. Another finding suggested that there might even be some backing going on in apparent time in a non-prenasal environment. In other words, when the sound is an L or a TH, like we have here with mouth, regardless of speaker neighborhood. So they could be Athens or non-Athens participants. It looks like in the absence of a nasal sound, this diphthong is actually moving in the opposite direction. And this is a space where current projects are focused. We're now looking at this diphthong with the larger data set that we have and examining a trend toward backing in a non-nasal environment. Slide. So very quickly, discussion here. What's the status of the diphthong in rural Southeast Ohio? Well, it seems that there is both a moderate and extreme fronting to be observed, and it may also be the case that we are backing in non-nasal environments, which again is a trending effect. We had one participant, in fact, who was an extreme fronter, over 1900 hertz in the prenasal environment, but backing everywhere else. So we have, and this was a very young speaker as well. So that's why age did not become a factor in the production changes, but it gives us a lot of information about what we might look at going forward. Let's go to the next slide. So discussion continued. The factors that might characterize these patterns. The extreme fronting was observed only among non-Athens speakers, again, folks outside the city limits. And the next slide, please. What constitutes a border? Okay, so city versus county, urban versus rural. When we see a lot of variation in the same geographic region, how do we now begin to identify the variation groups? There's definitely something more to it than just speaker orientation toward urban or rural. Communities of speakers, the pragmatics of context, all of these things are the areas where additional studies with current students are now going, and the kind of questions that studies tend to open up. Here are some really good questions to ask, and here are the new questions that these questions generate. So this is where we're currently headed. Let me go to the next slide. And talk about limitations as well. The sample size was fairly small with the first study, but as you saw from our introduction, we're now 2 times that, if not more, in the data that we have. And we'd like to look at this as well from a perceptual vantage point, not just production, and looking at less of the non-binary groupings. You know, looking at folks who tend to move between and among multiple communities of speakers. Would give us a much more sophisticated way to talk about speakers in our region. Let's go to the next slide very quickly. And I can just show you quickly why the participant data needs to be expanded. In the top half of this chart, you can see that participants that we've tentatively classified as urban, while the bottom half shows the rural participants. Obviously, we're in most need of urban participants who are over the age of 30, both men and women. More data from older folks in those areas would help us identify the trend of the owl backing, perhaps, and then also give us more insight into some of the other non-binary groupings that would be contributing to why language performance is observed in the ways that it is. I'd like to talk briefly about the Ohio Dialect Survey, but I'm also conscious of time. So I think what I'd like to do, Callie, is move to your discussion, and we can cycle back to this so that both you and Rasmia get a chance to talk, and then we can have discussion with respect to the survey and the Old Gods piece. How's that?
Sounds good to me.
All right, thank you very much.
Can everyone hear me okay? Can I get a yes, no? Say that's a no. Can everyone hear? I can't see you, so if you're giving me a thumbs up, it's not working. Okay, cool. Thank you all. All right, cool. Thank you guys. All right, I'm going to pop back to our slides. I always forget that too, that people can't see me when I'm presenting, that I can't see you when people are presenting. All right, so as I mentioned, my name is Callie Thayer, and I'm working with Dr. O'Malley on a lot of the projects that she mentioned. And I'm specifically going to be talking about the Language Matters project, campus campaign, and the language landscape that we're working in here in Southeast Ohio. So the Language Matters campaign was something that we wanted to begin as a linguistics department on our campus in order to allow those who are coming this part of Appalachia, to this region, to begin to experience some more of it in terms of the language that they were interacting with. When we were on campus, and I'm sure we all miss those days, what we created was a public space where people could share linguistic idioms, naming convention, meaning changes between languages, shifts in sounds and expression, the difference between positive and negative expression, or how emotion might occupy space in language. I was going through images that we'd taken of the beginning was this Language Matters board in our hallway in the linguistics department, and all I could feel was nostalgia. It's like, don't you miss this, being able to be on campus and interact in those spaces? The good news is we kept a record. We kept a record of all of our responses, and they were shared on social media, but that also means that we have data that we can mine later if we'd like to take a look at how people perceive questions asked of them and how they're interacting with the language that they see returned to them. We're very lucky in the linguistics department to have, I think, over a dozen international languages represented, and several countries, or several more countries. And so it was really cool to be able to see how all of the students from all over the world were interacting with the language landscape that they found themselves in. So here's an example of the full size of the board. This is actually the one I picked because most recently, this was one of the last ones that we had before we ended up going into lockdown last March. It's from Valentine's Day, where we were sharing different terms of endearment. And it was really amazing to be able to see people share not just how they expressed affection for others in their own language, but also interact with the different ways that they saw it expressed in other languages. Now, when we did go into lockdown, we actually continued this virtually. So this is a sample of one of the virtual boards that we put together. It's actually our first one. And so this was created individually by our linguistic students and their friends, sharing in their own language or languages that they spoke, different ways to say, stay home, stay safe, stay healthy, take care. And I really appreciated a lot of the participation we got. It really surprised me how willing people were to not only take photos of themselves, but to have those photos published and to be shared so that they could continue to interact with each other linguistically. So that was really amazing, and I appreciated it. I want to move on a little bit to some more detail about the complete language landscape that we're working with. And that means I'm going to talk a little bit about the Map Athens project. If we were all physically in Athens, I would encourage you to go take a look at the ridges, or to go downtown and do the art walk, or to go check out the kids' nature hike. But happily, you can actually do this from your own home through the Map Athens project, which is a project that's been run through the Ohio Museum Complex, and it's curated by Dr. Nancy Stevens, who is amazing, and I am eternally grateful to her for her help on this. There are currently 20 digital tours of Athens and the surrounding associated areas available and growing. There are 4 that are expected to come out before May this year to bring the total to 24. And so between my own cohort, the 2021 cohort of Masters in Applied Linguistics students, and the OU Translation Club, we picked 2 tours that we would work on translating into as many languages as possible to make them accessible to people who arrive on the Athens campus who'd like to be able to interact with the space around them more, but might be limited by some of the languages they speak. So specifically, we chose to do this because of the audience and the context that we have. OU is home to more than 1,000 international students on a regular basis, but only 400 of them are undergraduates. A lot of them are graduate students who usually, when they come, they bring their families with them. This is usually both theirs and their families' first experience of the Appalachian region, and they're often looking for a way to connect with the place and the community that they now find themselves in. Some of them will end up living here for between 4 and 7 years. Some come to stay. But the Map Athens project is really amazing because it helps connect people to this place. So here's what the page looks like. When you go to the Map Athens website, you can just Google Map Athens and it'll show up. But if you'd like to get there through the ohio.edu website, it's through the museum complex. And you'll get this big, beautiful masthead, which this is the campus that you would be visiting if you would be able to come to the conference in person. And you'll scroll down and you'll see a bunch of these different hikes that you can go on, or these walks. Now, if you'll notice underneath the kids' nature hike section, you'll see there are other languages available: German, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and Vietnamese. We're still working on Arabic and Chinese for this one. I'm really also hoping we can get a Bengali or a Hindi speaker to help us on that because it's another large population that we are hosts. But as you can see, there's so many. You can go on a birding walk. There's a spring poetry tour, which is accompanied by poetry written by local Athenian poets. As you can see in the wellness walk, we have that as well translated into Arabic, Chinese, Portuguese, and Spanish. But so the tours continue. You want to learn more about how the land has been used, the river and the bikeways that are around campus. You want to learn more about how women's history in Athens developed. You want to take the Black History tour with the architectural amble. There's a Regis tree tour. There's a specific species of bird nesting tour. There are so many, including a telecampus hike, which is actually a campus affiliated with OU that's out in the Tetons, which is beautiful. So highly recommend any and all of these. So let's say you want to go on the kids' nature hike. You click onto this page and you have the option to go through this tour in any one of these 6 languages. A lot of these languages are spoken by international students and their families who come to campus who might be looking for a way to get outside, to see more of the community they found themselves in, and to interact with this space. The way the tours work is you can go through them on a mobile device, you can go through them virtually only on a laptop device or a desktop device. And they are actual GIS pinned map tours that you can follow stop by stop. So this is the kids' nature hike at the Ridges, and say a family was here and they wanted to take their kids on a walk because they wanted to be able to interact more with the environment here in Appalachia that they find themselves in. They can get all the information they need to describe where they are, what they're looking at, the different seasons they find themselves in, the history of the area, and they can do that all in their own language. This is a sample from the wellness walk that happens at the Ridges. And so again, you get an overview of the map of the different stops that you'll take yourself on, as well as a description done by a native speaker of that language that is able to guide you through the area that you're in, allowing you to not just interact with the space in your own language, but in the context of the greater space. So when we say we've translated these tours, we don't just mean we've done a word-for-word translation so people can read it. We mean that we've taken a holistic approach to make sure that not only is each stop's information translated accurately, but the point and the purpose of the tour is collective and correct to the original intention of the creation of the tour. So here on the wellness walk, there's a good big conversation happening about mental health and the interactions that we have with the world outdoors. And for some of these, it was actually really difficult for our translators because some of the words that we use in English to discuss mental health have no direct translation into other languages. This is a really great project to work on. This is the last example I'm going to show. This is the first stop on the wellness walk that was translated by one of our future graduating master's students in Chinese. And not only is it a beautiful walk, but it's also a beautiful message. So I'd highly encourage you to go and check out one of the Map Athens tours and get a chance to interact with this space, even if you can't physically be here, but also know that we're encouraging people who are new to the region, who might feel isolated because of their linguistic background, to reach out and connect with the space around them and to be able to do that in a way that is comfortable and comprehensive for them. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to my colleague Razmia, who's going to talk about her project, and I'm super excited.
Thank you. So again, my name is Razmia Shraim, and I conducted a research project under the Ohio Language and Culture Lab at Ohio University, run by Dr. O'Malley, and it's called Am I Speaking Correct? An Analysis of Students' Perceptions of Language Variation. So a little bit about me. I'm an undergraduate senior at OU. I am a communication sciences and disorders major, and I have a linguistics minor and diversity studies certificate. So why am I pursuing research in the linguistics department if I'm not a linguistics major? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Go ahead and change the next slide. So as a future speech-language pathologist, I refer to ASHA's website a lot for references and resources. ASHA is the American Speech and Hearing Association. And I strive to be a speech-language pathologist that works with culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And I was wondering how ASHA incorporated cultural competency into our curriculum. And so I found this checklist, and the only thing mentioned about dialect is at the very bottom. And it says, I understand that there are several American English dialects, and I recognize that all English speakers use a dialect of English. And I found this item to be very neutral and not really reinforcing the idea that all variations of English should be treated equally or that one is not more correct than the other. So it made me wonder, how do other people within my major, could you go back to the, sorry. How do other people in my major perceive other variations of English, and how does the general undergraduate population perceive other dialects? So now we can change to the next slide. So what is a dialect? A dialect is a variety of a language that identifies with a particular region or social group. And dialects are also referred to as variants or varieties. An example would be, how would you address a group of 2 or more people? So some people would say you guys, you all, y'all, etc. And so perceptual dialectology, this study is a perceptual dialectology study. And to recap, the definition of perceptual dialectology from the Handbook of Perceptual Dialectology, written by Dennis Preston, who basically pioneered this branch of linguistic study, is the branch of folk linguistics that deals with regional distribution of linguistic features from the point of view of non-specialists. So the most well-known perceptual dialectology method was giving people blank maps and having them draw circles around areas of a region where they thought people spoke correctly or pleasantly, etc. So as you can see, the participant in this map behind the slide circled areas and labeled how they perceive people in those areas to speak English. So over there in the Northeast, they circled that area and said propers. And at the top of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, they labeled Canadian accent. And then for a part of the Appalachian region, they labeled it y'alls. So though maps were a common form of perceptual dialectology, my study was performed a little bit differently. Slide. So my project allowed participants to evaluate 3 different American English variations that are popular and relevant to Ohio University. So these variations include mainstream American English, which would be considered the mainstream variant, African American Vernacular English, which is one of the non-mainstream variants, and Appalachian English, which is another one of the non-mainstream variants. But this one in particular is specific to Southeast Ohio. So whenever I refer to Appalachian English in this presentation, I'm referring to the specific characteristics of Southeastern Ohio. So students will analyze sentences from each of the 3 variations and rate them on correctness, pleasantness, and familiarity based on their perceptions. And this would give us insight on how people who speak different variations of American English view each other. So the way I went about this study, I created a survey so that it was easily accessible for everybody. I asked some standard demographic questions to get an idea of who our participants were, about race and ethnicity, gender, where you're from. We asked about campus location because originally we intended to send this survey out to multiple campus locations, but because of COVID, we kind of hit a roadblock and we weren't able to do that. And I also asked about first generation status. So we recorded 20 audio samples from speakers across the 3 varieties, a male and female for each group. So there were a total of 6 speakers. And we used sliding scales under each audio designated for rating purposes. And so they were able to rate each audio sample on correctness, pleasantness, and familiarity. Slide. So this is how each stimuli was presented in the survey we conducted. Each stimuli recording can be found above the sliders, and participants can hit play and listen to it as many times as they need to. And then they rate how each sentence sounds in terms of correctness, pleasantness, and familiarity. We started each slider in the neutral position so that if left unfinished, it did not severely skew the results either way. So 1 would be the least, and then 10 would be the most. And using the sliders made the survey very user-friendly and accessible on either a phone or laptop, which would not have been as easy to conduct if we did this through paper and hand-drawn maps. Slide. So we had a total of 19 stimuli with about 5 to 6 sentences in each variant, and we gathered these stimuli from the Yale Grammatical Diversity Project, which aims to spread awareness of the various American English varieties and how certain phenomena are used. From their data, we created our own sentences, which are all related to school and university life, and had the speakers triple check each sentence to ensure that they sounded as natural as possible, which would then elicit the best results possible. And speakers actually ended up altering more than half of these sentences, so that ensured us that we have come up with very accurate stimuli. Next slide. So here were the demographics that we collected of our participants. 82% of the participants were female. This is probably because we surveyed very female-heavy classes such as communication sciences and disorders, special education, and linguistics classes. And 90% of the participants were white. There was a more or less equal distribution of class rank among participants. There were less fourth-year students, primarily because we surveyed these lower-level classes. 84% of the participants were from Ohio, and 28% of students were first-generation college students. So here's a table that displays the average scores of correctness, pleasantness, and familiarity within each variant. Mainstream American English received the highest scores across the board for correctness, pleasantness, and familiarity. African American Vernacular English received the lowest scores in correctness and pleasantness, and Appalachian English received the lowest score in familiarity. So we ran some t-tests to determine if there was a significant difference between each variety and each category, and we found that the results from those tests indicated that Mainstream American English stimuli had significantly higher scores than African American English and Appalachian English stimuli in all three categories. Appalachian English stimuli had a significantly higher average rating in correctness when compared to African American Vernacular English, though there was no significant difference found between the other two categories of pleasantness and familiarity between those two varieties. And there was no significant difference between male and female speakers in correctness, pleasantness, or familiarity. So that was interesting to see, because we did think that maybe the female speakers would be rated slightly lower than the male speakers, but there was no difference really. Next slide. So here are some examples. Here are some of the stimuli that were in the survey, and I included some audio samples. So Callie, go ahead and play the first one.
The weird thing is that the professor forgot my name today.
So this was the female mainstream American English speaker, and this sentence got an 8.09 in correctness, a 7.71 in pleasantness, and an 8.95 in familiarity, which were very high scores compared to the rest of the survey. And the next audio.
I'd rather sleep than go to class.
The male mainstream American English speaker, this sentence I think got the highest ratings with a 9.4 out of 10 in correctness, 8.77 in pleasantness, and about a 9.5 in familiarity. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to see significant.
The weird thing is that the professor forgot my name today.
I'd rather sleep than go to class.
So the next slide, you can see that these scores drop dramatically. So this is the African American Vernacular English stimuli, and the first one, go ahead and play it.
I'm finna go to the library so I can study.
I'll be counting down the days till school over.
Okay, so the male one says, I'm gonna go to the library so I can study. So this sentence got a 5 out of 10 for correctness, a 6 out of 10 for pleasantness, and an 8 out of 10 for familiarity, because finna is a word that is more commonly used amongst our generation, so people are more aware of it, but it still nonetheless got lower ratings in correctness and pleasantness. And the second recording was our female speaker.
I'll be counting down the days till school over.
And I believe this sentence got one of the lowest ratings, 3 out of 10 for correctness, 4.9 out of 10 for pleasantness, and about a 6.9 for familiarity. So the next slide we have are the Appalachian English speakers from the Southeast Ohio region, and our male Appalachian English speaker, this is one of his samples.
You stay at the library too late anymore.
So he received low scores, 4.3 out of 10 for correctness, 4.3 for pleasantness, and about a 5.4 for familiarity. And the female speaker,
I done lost my keys.
This was one of her samples, and she got a 3.7 out of 10 for correctness, a 4.7 for pleasantness, and a 6.4 for familiarity. So these were just some examples from the study. There were plenty more, but they generally stayed around the same score range that you see here. So
you stay at the library too late anymore.
I done.
Okay, so from these results, we were able to draw some conclusions about how these students perceived each of these American English variants. Mainstream American English was by far rated the most correct, pleasant, and familiar to students who participated in the study, which indicated that this variety was typically perceived as correct or most correct. It would have been unlikely to see African American Vernacular English or Appalachian English rank high in any of the three categories, and that is what we saw. They did not rank very high. And when observing how Appalachian English was rated and perceived by the students who participated in the study, it is evident that not a lot of students can identify the characteristics of this variety that presented in the survey stimuli, as we saw with that very low familiarity rating. So this study was very eye-opening to all of us at the Ohio Language and Culture Lab. Being at Ohio University in Southeast Ohio, it was somewhat surprising to see that not a lot of students were familiar with the stimuli presented by the Appalachian English speakers. But with our lab, we hope to spread more awareness of the language specific to this region. And this study has shed some light on how some of our OU students perceive the language spoken around this area. That's it.
Thank you for that, Rasmia. I think something else to point out with respect to Rasmia's findings is that the participants are generally responding to a correctness of a syntactic construction. It's not a lot about accent at this point. And when we talk about accent in a sociolinguistics area, we're talking about pronunciation. That's just a component of a variant. Pronunciation is one component, vocabulary choice is another, and then the way you structure your word form and your syntax is another. And I think primarily the responses here are based on syntax, and that's something to probably dig deeper into and expand on if folks are more interested in pronunciation or vocabulary or syntax. This one's really heavily focused on the syntax. So while you might be listening to those samples and saying they don't all sound very different, the syntax is very different. The pronunciations are pretty consistent, but the syntax really drives it home. Callie, would you like to take off with your
I wanted to make a quick, I really did want to make a quick comment just about how so when Rasmia said we found this really fascinating, I think one of the reasons that we're going to talk very shortly about another project we're starting to undertake is that there are a lot of sources that describe the Appalachian varieties of English that exist as being incredibly pleasant and homey, and it feels like it's your grandma telling you stories, and yet when we present samples of this to the general population, or we survey a group of people, it gets super low ratings in terms of pleasantness, correctness, and those perceptions were really surprising to us. We expected a higher degree of familiarity and a higher degree of pleasantness, and we didn't find that to be true. So yeah, that was something that really it blew my mind, that's for sure.
I think very often correctness is conflated with familiarity and pleasantness. And if those can be teased apart better, I think we would still find, yeah, I love the sound of this. I don't recognize that as something that I would write in a paper or encounter in a classroom, but I really love the sound of this. And I think too often those are conflated. We need to be maybe more precise with questioning. Maybe other people have different suggestions out there, listeners.
But if everyone's okay with it, I'm going to jump into one last little thing that we're going to talk about before we open up complete for questions. And I'm going to ask Dr. O'Malley to please throw a link in the chat for me to a Google form that I'm going to invite you guys to fill out if you would like. So if you guys are here to talk about Old Gods of Appalachia, then I have what you need. So one of the reasons that so let me jump right into this project really quick. So if you're here and you're familiar with the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, that's awesome. So am I. I'm a huge fan. This is my Old Gods t-shirt. So one of the things that we found really interesting about Rasmia's project was, again, we assumed, or we supposed, that we would get a high degree of familiarity and a high degree of pleasantness in reaction to the variety of Appalachian English that we presented to the group of people surveyed, because this is one of the things that we appreciate about Appalachian English, specifically some of the dialects that we find in and around Southeast Ohio, is that we perceive them, or at least we as surveyors perceive them, as being pleasant and familiar. And one of the things that's great about this podcast, the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, is it is often commented on how beautiful it is. The narrators, the speakers, the storytellers all have wonderful, beautiful dialects very different dialects of Appalachian English. But so when Rasmia's project happened and we started receiving those results was when I started asking questions about perception of Appalachian English varieties throughout the world. And I figured there was no better way to survey that than to look at the Old Gods podcast. So this is the beginning of the Old Gods podcast project. The title of it is How One Podcast Brought a Regional Dialect to the World. So if you're not familiar with Old Gods of Appalachia, it is a podcast, it's a fiction podcast created by Steve Shell and Cam Collins, who are both themselves speakers of Appalachian English. A variety, Steve is a speaker of a variety from Virginia and Cam from Kentucky. The show itself is set in a fictional Appalachia, mostly areas of Kentucky, Virginia, Ohio, and Tennessee. The first episode aired on October 31st, so Halloween of 2019. And in 1 year, the show received more than a dozen international awards, so both in the US and abroad, got a review in the New York Times, and has reached the top charts in over 27 countries. It was 27 at the writing of these slides. It's 29 now. Here are the countries where it ranks the highest, or in the top 100 of fiction and science fiction podcasts. Now notice, if you look at the countries that are highlighted in yellow, you'll see the US, Australia, New Zealand. These are places where English is the majority language spoken. But if you look at Canada, South Africa, Philippines, Singapore, these are areas where English has a shared status with another language or several other languages. The thing that surprised me is, why is this podcast in the top 10 in Germany? It's listened to very frequently in Malaysia, in Jamaica, in Belgium. It surprises me to no end that this is such a well-loved function of storytelling, and in so many different places. And the thing that blew my mind is that these are areas where there are people who, in all likelihood, throughout their entire lives, would never actually encounter a native speaker of a variety of Appalachian languages. And yet they're listening to these stories, which are being told by authentic speakers of the dialect, even if the stories themselves are fictional, and enjoying them. And I wanted to know, what is their perception of this? Why do they think this sounds so good? Obviously, they like it because they keep listening, or it wouldn't be ranked so highly. So here's our goal for this project, is I want to be able to create a data gathering tool that is inclusive of the 3 different experiences someone could have if they're a fan or a listener of this podcast. And those are, I am from Appalachia or I speak a variety of Appalachian English. I'm not from Appalachia and I don't speak Appalachian English, but I'm aware of the fact that varieties of AE exist. Or, and these are the people I'm super interested in, I'm not from Appalachia and I've never heard Appalachian English or any variety of it before. And I'm really interested in gathering information similar to what Resmia has gathered in terms of perceptions, both of the language of the podcast and how that may have influenced self-perceptions for speakers who already use a variety of Appalachian English, but also how people may or may not be incorporating aspects of their language, of the language from the show into their day-to-day use. We've already had in fan conversations adjacent to the podcast, we've had conversations with British folks who have started using specific words and varieties. Specifically, the word boys has made it into, and them shortened from the TH into just the last EM sound. So M boys instead of them boys. When referring to a group of either male people or male dogs or whatever. We had someone talking about how they refer to they have 3 dogs and they now refer to them as M boys, which is straight from the podcast. So if you want to help, if you would like to collaborate on this project with us, you can get in touch with me. This is my email, kalinda.thayer@gmail.com. Or more organized, you could fill out this short Google form, which Dr. O'Malley will be dropping in the chat for you or has already done. Or I will send a link to indicate your interest or offer us suggestions. So thank you, family. Thank you so much for entertaining this fun part, the fun random fictional podcasty part of this presentation.
Callie, can you go ahead? You're going to have to go ahead and put the Google form.
Gonna go grab it. Yep.
No. At this point, it's just now 10 o'clock. So we have about 15 minutes that we can, as a group, have conversation and answer some questions. Tiffany, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Michelle, I wondered in the study that you talked about, did you see any variations within Athens County in terms of like the different communities like Amesville or Gloucester or, outside of Athens City?
Yeah, in fact, that's what led us to start thinking about, we need a less binary separation of participants, because we've gotten folks from almost all of those counties mentioned or highlighted in that map. And we do notice variation, and we expected it to be more noticeable among age groups or between age groups, when in fact it appears to be a little more regional with respect to distance from Athens Center. So yeah, that is where, when you start analyzing details, you start creating new questions, and definitely we found variety there.
Yeah, I'm from Washington County, and it seems like the further you get away from Marietta, the more pronounced it is. My dad has a very thick Appalachian accent, but
yeah,
I don't, and I don't know why, but that's a whole different conversation. And then the other question I had was, Rasmia, I don't know if I missed this. Where were the students that you surveyed from? I know that you talked about the classes that you got them from. Were many of them from here, or where did they come from originally?
So a lot of the students came from the 3 bigger cities in Ohio, so Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati area. We did have, again, 28% of the students were first generation students, and those students typically were from the Southeast Ohio region. So we had a lot of students from these more urban city areas who do speak mainstream English a lot more than the other participants in the study, because we surveyed like classes within the College of Health Sciences and Professions that typically attract a lot of those kinds of students, if that makes sense. So basically a lot of the students came from Central Ohio, Cincinnati area, Cleveland area.
I just wonder, since you said a lot of them were first and second year students, if they haven't left campus enough to have been exposed to, within Athens, you can come here and not even feel like you're in Southeast Ohio, honestly, in my opinion. So I didn't know if, maybe because they were younger, they hadn't been exposed to it as much, because they haven't been out, especially like education students haven't been out in the schools yet at that point. So, yeah, I just was curious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're correct in that first year and second year students don't typically get out a lot in the community. This, in my mind, how I was thinking of it is, okay, well, all of these students study language in some capacity, whether that be they're trying to be speech therapists or linguists or, special educators in schools. So to me, yeah, they're not very familiar with that particular variant, but it was interesting to see as a whole that they did not find that variety correct. And they found one to be more correct than the other, and how that would affect how they treat whoever they're working with in the future in a professional aspect, academic aspect, all these things. So yeah. But
when I do my cultural competency trainings for social service providers, healthcare providers, and things like that, and health departments, we always talk about dialect, and people unintentionally stereotyping people because of the way they sound, and some people aren't aware that happens, and yeah. I don't know. It says a lot about Athens to me. Your study does, just about like the fact that you can be here and not even be exposed, to the dialect from around here. So very interesting.
If I may, remember too, I think Rasmia did mention this, but initially our plan was to have a sampling not just from Athens, but from each of the regional campuses, because our anticipation was that folks who live farther from this space are going to at least be more familiar with that variant, whether or not they use it. And that's part of what the Ohio Language Use Survey gets at. We recognize a lot of varieties, whether or not we're habitually using them or not, or categorizing them just for specific contexts. And I think you guys are really on track with the youth of the participants and their lack of experience with varieties. And so they tend to fall back on what they recognize as grammatically correct, or what they've been taught as formulaic productions for professional language use or academic language use. And I bet if we even did this study again with the same population, only in Athens, but we did it with juniors and seniors, we'd get different results.
Yeah.
I don't remember I don't mean, Rasmia, I don't mean to speak for you, but I don't know if you remember when you were first talking about your data, like when we first got like preliminary reports back from your data, one of the things you mentioned was you wondered if it would be the same if we had a different subject matter, because all of your samples were about school. It was all conversation about school. It was with students. So it made sense that these were together, but I wondered if this would be the same, if we'd have the same reaction, if they weren't sentences or topics that were focused specifically on school. And so I think that might be true as well. Like if we were to take if we were to remove that context, if there would be differences. But yeah, I think it's a really cool study, and I really would love to see it expanded because I think you got some interesting results.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of room to expand. And I think it provides a lot of implications about, what are we teaching these students who are supposed to go out and help other people who are from these linguistically diverse backgrounds. So it's an indicator too of what we should be including in our curriculum for these students.
Other comments or questions, always welcome. And of course, if your sound isn't working or if you're trying to ask a question and it's not working, feel free to throw it up in the chat and we can monitor it there. All the tech bases are covered.
While we wait, I'd also like to put this out there. Tiffany, you mentioned cultural competency workshops that you do with healthcare providers and others in the region. I would love to know more about what you do there, and I'd love to be able to collaborate or just offer my services when and if you need. That sounds like, because in our department, we develop a lot of English content for non-native speakers or for folks using English in business or healthcare or, critical communications and things, but it's typically targeting a non-native speaker. But I love that you're also able to integrate the cultural competencies for healthcare workers. I guess you're doing that through the ARI?
Yeah, I've been doing health departments. I did the VA Center in Chillicothe, the Southeast Ohio Legal Aid Society. That was an interesting one because many of them were not from this area. And, if you come from an area where you're definitely not a first generation college student, then you're probably even less likely to have been exposed to, local dialect. So I try to reiterate to people that just because you're from here doesn't mean you don't have a dirty lens when it comes to looking at people in the region. Yeah, and that would be great because, obviously I don't have, I know when I hear it, but I have no way to describe it and, or to talk to people about it. So that would be great.
Very cool.
I love that metaphor, having a dirty lens. I enjoy that.
Sometimes people from here are the most prejudiced against other people from here. Which can be really frustrating. And I think it really all goes back to a lack of context. We're being from here, we're not taught at all about our own history or our own culture. It's like we aren't taught about Cold Wars and activism and all of the great reasons to be proud to be from here. We're taught that to succeed, you have to leave. And if you stay, that you're a failure. And so, we're not, so people here are often a little bit more negative about people from here because we're taught that we shouldn't be proud to be from here, basically. So, yeah.
One of the interviews in the Southern Ohio Language Project, I helped to gather a few of them, and one of them, I can't tell you which one, but one of them is my father-in-law, who is from Scioto and Pike counties, which are square in the middle of Southern and Southeast Ohio, and he calls it washing. He says, when you leave, you've got to wash yourself of your accent or wash yourself of that speech. And he refers to it as dirty. And it's so interesting because that's the way he talked. And he's an incredibly successful person, like runs his own business, owns his own house. Like, what else do you want? And he still speaks of it that way, that it's this process of literally washing yourself of the way that you speak here at home.
That's the way my dad sounds. And I was actually, Kenna, who's in this session as well, she's from the same place I am. And we were texting while you all were talking about like people saying Washington County and, where that comes from and that kind of thing. So it's funny that you bring that up.
I see too, Rachel York is also commenting about the prosody in some of the recordings too, that they sound a little bit like they're reading. And I noticed that when I listened to them just today, it hadn't been as clear to me prior, but hearing them today, I had the same thought. Again, I love Rasmia's methodology. So I'd love to be able to do a little tweaking and re-release it again to all of the regionals and then do it again here on campus. But yeah, thank you for that input.
Rachel York, I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that we try really hard to do in the Southern Ohio Language Project is to kind of get at that really natural production, that really what is Labov calls it the true vernacular, right? It's like to get people into that space where they're able to just speak freely how they would like to. And this is actually something we're really hoping or I'm really hoping we can do. We're kind of caught in copyright hell right now, working on the Old Gods project, because we'd like to be able to actually use audio samples from the podcast to have people hear that production in the same way that they normally would, not to read it from text, not to have someone else reproduce it and have it sound robotic or not prosodic the way that it should, but to have it sound the way that the listeners would originally hear it. So yeah, I think that natural production is really important, and I'm hoping that we can lean more into that as we gather more data.
So something I was just thinking about, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Robert Gipe's books. He writes, he has 3 books out now, but I teach 2 of them in my Intro to Appalachia class, and students, he writes in a very like dialectical way, I guess is how you would describe it, yep. Right? And so I have students sometimes, I had one student who said he was offended by it because it sounded like he was writing, he's like, this just sounds like a stereotype the way he's writing. And I was like, but if you've heard Robert Gipe speak, that's how he talks. And he was writing when he talked. And so students are often, they have a hard time with the first book because they can't hear it in their heads when they're reading it. And so it takes them a little while to get into it. And I just think about, you know, speakers like Robert, and then like if you've heard Silas House has a very distinct Appalachian dialect, and I find it very soothing to listen to. But some people are very like, they think it's a little over the top and they don't believe it's real necessarily, which I think is interesting.
Well, I just recommended, oh, sorry, Dr. O'Malley. I love that you mentioned that, because so Gipe's and it's Vershawn Ashanti Young, his piece called Should Writers Use They Own English, which is very heavily African-American vernacular English. It's an incredibly, I just recommended Young's piece to a colleague of mine who is speaking with students who are users of multiple dialects of English about when and how to use their own dialects in their writing. So I love that you mentioned that you bring Geist up, because I feel like that's something that we need to see more of, is not just the dialects as they're used and the varieties as they're used, but in spaces in which we wouldn't expect them. So the first time I read Young's piece, which is very, very much written in African-American vernacular, it was jarring because it was a very academic argument written in language I'm used to hearing spoken by my friends and not on the page. And so when I first read Geist's work, same thing. I was like, I can hear my father-in-law here, but I'm not used to reading research done by him. And so that to be able to take those varieties and place them in positions of higher learning, of occupation, of places where people aren't used to seeing them, I think is really important. So I'm so glad you mentioned that.
I think what's also important with respect to those is that we are comfortable hearing them, and those kinds of pieces invite you to read them out loud. And I think maybe that's where students struggle, because they expect it to be something they can manage in silent reading. And in fact, that might be a really good experience in a group setting. A better, you know, as you're probably learning, Tiffany, to introduce them to it as a group, because they need to be walked through the process. I'm reminded too of a writer that some friends of mine and I discovered a couple of years back. He's actually from Pomeroy. He died in the late 1800s, but he wrote in what is today considered Afro-Latin, African-American English and Appalachian English, and he wrote poetry and short stories. His name was James Campbell. And there's a new grave marker for him down there in town. And there's a history center down there that houses a bunch of his work, but I have content I'd be happy to share if you're interested. Also, a bunch of his work, his gleanings, I think collections and gleanings, it's in the OU archives. And they will allow you to see them. They'll come in and hold the book with gloves on.
Did you present about that a few years ago? Yeah, I was in that one. That was the first time I had heard of him. I was surprised to learn about that. He was a teacher or something.
Yeah, he was a teacher and a newspaper writer, and he was the president of the West Virginia State University Teachers College. 24 years old. He was a product of that system where white, European Americans were being trained as teachers and sent into the new westward expansion, and they were making their way to Southern Ohio and Northern West Virginia, and they were teaching in integrated schools here in this region, and Campbell was a product of that education system. But he wrote in his dialect, and that was like, of course, he was a contemporary of others who were not using dialect, and so he was kind of overlooked at the time, but now might be the time to resurrect his pieces.
I'd also be curious, and I know this probably isn't your all's field in regards to writing. I was criticized in my dissertation for being too colloquial, but I was writing about Appalachian people for Appalachian people, so I didn't feel like it was inappropriate, but I had to go through and do a lot of revising because of that. And I feel like that is really harmful to, people who study this area and what we're doing, because I don't necessarily care academics think about my writing. I wanted Appalachian people to read my writing. So yeah, I don't know if that's common or not, but
I was given similar feedback in other pieces that I wrote prior to my dissertation, and it was all about audience consideration. Don't be so colloquial, don't be so accessible. You need to follow this protocol. But I think for your audience and for your means, you need to consider the ultimate goal, and there needs to be some balance there. I totally agree with you. Hi, Michelle. Are we getting close on time?
I'm popping in. Yep, your time is up. So.
Okay.
Just want to remind everybody that the next sessions start at 10:30. Check the program for those that you'd like to attend. And also want to make sure you're aware of our awesome opening ceremonies this afternoon that starts at 2, between 2 and 4. We have an excellent plenary of some excellent and well-known authors, and really want to thank you all for attending the session today. And I hope you attend as many as you can. And if you can't, you'll be able to view the recordings. Thanks very much, everyone. And
Thank you so much.
Hit your leave button and you'll be out of this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. See you, Tiffany.
Bye.